War is expensive, but modern war is something else entirely. Across the world, governments are quietly spending billions of dollars every single month not on rebuilding cities, not on schools, not on healthcare, but on weapons, ammunition, drones, radars, and defense systems. At the center of one of the biggest military spending patterns in modern history stands a conflict that has reshaped Europe's security architecture: the Russia-Ukraine war. Since February 2022, the conflict has become the largest military confrontation in Europe since World War II. Millions have been displaced, cities shattered, and the continent's geopolitical balance has shifted in ways no one imagined. But behind the battlefield, behind the trenches and the drones, there is a second war taking place, a war of budgets, contracts, logistics, and alliances. This is where NATO's spending enters the story. In late 2024, reports began emerging that NATO was preparing a massive long-term military support structure for Ukraine. Analysts and journalists started discussing numbers rarely seen in European defense budgets. Among them, one figure stood out and captured the world's attention: $1 billion per month. But was this a confirmed plan, a proposal, or just a misunderstood figure? This documentary will break down everything: the reports, the funding structures, and the controversies behind the idea of NATO spending over $1 billion a month to supply weapons to Ukraine. This is not about supporting or opposing any side. It is an attempt to understand what is actually happening behind the scenes. So today, we step behind the headlines and search for the truth. February 2022 marked a turning point in European history. Russian forces crossed the Ukrainian border, triggering a devastating conflict. But while civilians endured shelling, a parallel war unfolded behind closed doors. This war was not fought with rifles alone. It was waged in boardrooms, logistics centers, and NATO planning offices. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was not a direct combatant. Its members didn't deploy soldiers, but they became an essential lifeline for Ukraine. Initial support was ad hoc. Individual countries offered what they could. Some donated tanks, others artillery, some drones. These efforts were fragmented and difficult to coordinate. By late 2024, it became evident that a structured, systematic approach was necessary. NATO implemented a formal framework, later referred to as PEARL, the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List. This mechanism became the backbone of Ukraine's military supply chain. PEARL is more than a list. It's a sophisticated procurement and logistics system. It catalogs every piece of equipment Ukraine requires, prioritizing urgent needs to sustain its defense. Items on the list include artillery, ammunition, armored vehicles, drones, and air defense units. Each NATO member can contribute by either donating existing stock or purchasing new weapons specifically for Ukraine. This system allows for coordinated and predictable deliveries. So why was PEARL necessary? First, many NATO countries had already donated significant equipment, and their own reserves were running low. Second, Ukrainian forces needed a predictable supply to plan operations. And third, PEARL allowed NATO to buy directly from defense manufacturers, ensuring weapons met technical specifications. Through this mechanism, NATO created the foundation for the billion-dollar per month figures circulating in the media. But why is NATO involved at all? Ukraine is not a NATO member. The alliance's involvement is strategic and preventive. First, geography and security. Ukraine shares borders with multiple NATO members. A Russian victory could destabilize Eastern Europe, threatening Poland, Slovakia, and Romania. Second, political values. Many NATO countries consider Ukraine a democratic partner, and supporting its sovereignty aligns with the alliance's principles. Third, strategic calculations. By supplying weapons instead of deploying troops, NATO can counter Russian influence without escalating into a direct confrontation. This brings us to the billion-dollar reports. Between 2024 and 2025, media outlets and official statements created confusion. Some reports confirmed billions spent in total, while others referenced hopes for monthly funding targets. Headlines claiming NATO would spend $1 billion per month from 2026 went viral. Let's look at the verified facts. Fact 1. NATO did mobilize approximately $4 billion under PEARL programs in 2025, spread across several months. Fact 2. The $1 billion per month figure referred to targets or political aspirations, not a confirmed official spending plan. For 2026, NATO officially committed to at least $1 billion per year, a far cry from the per-month figure. Fact 3. Misinterpretation by the media amplified the number, turning it into a perceived truth in the public mind, even though it was a goal, not a guarantee. This distinction is critical. So, is $1 billion a month even realistic? Modern warfare is extraordinarily expensive. A single Patriot missile costs around $4 million. A modern artillery shell can be up to $8,000. Tanks, drones, radar systems, and fuel add hundreds of millions more. If Ukraine fires 5,000 artillery shells per day, that alone costs roughly $20 million a day, or $600 million a month. Adding other equipment, a monthly total exceeding $1 billion, is financially plausible, but logistically and politically challenging. European countries face budget deficits and competing priorities. Defense industries may struggle to produce equipment at such a high rate. Sustaining this level of spending requires unprecedented coordination and political will. Supplying Ukraine is more than just money. It is a complex logistical operation. Factories in Europe and the US must produce high volumes of advanced weapons. Equipment moves via trucks, trains, and ships across borders. Strategic depots store weapons safely until they reach the front lines. This is a war fought in factories and offices, not just on battlefields. So, who benefits? Ukraine gains predictable supplies and stronger defenses. For NATO's European members, their defense industries grow, creating jobs and strengthening their geopolitical influence. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Rheinmetall, and Raytheon profit massively from contracts. The conflict also reshapes global markets for oil, metals, and semiconductors. The strategic implications are significant. NATO's support demonstrates that alliances can arm non-member countries at scale. It sends deterrent messages to Russia and other global actors, and it encourages innovation in drones, AI-guided weapons, and surveillance systems. Despite media claims, certainty is rare. Some NATO members may under-deliver. Production delays could reduce supply, and geopolitical shifts might affect funding. However, the perception of relentless support itself becomes a tool of war. Both Ukraine and Russia base strategic decisions on what they believe NATO can deliver. Picture Europe behind the headlines, factories running day and night, producing artillery shells and missiles, warehouses stacked with armor and drones, trains and ships transporting equipment across borders. This is modern war, conducted in whispers, spreadsheets, and contracts as much as on battlefields. For Ukraine, it ensures survival. For NATO, it reinforces unity. And for the world, it signals how wars are funded and fought in the 21st century. NATO's support for Ukraine involves a massive financial and logistical effort. But what does sustaining this support really mean in practical terms? There's been talk of a potential cost of $1 billion per month. If this were achieved, it would do more than just transfer money. It would reshape economies, influence political decisions, and drive industrial production to unprecedented levels. Let's break down what this actually looks like. First, let's talk about the direct military costs. Modern weapons are incredibly expensive. A single Patriot missile costs roughly $4 million. Ukraine has deployed hundreds of drones, artillery shells, and armored vehicles. When you add in fuel, ammunition, and maintenance, the monthly operational costs start to approach that billion-dollar mark. Then there are the industrial and production costs. To supply weapons consistently, factories in Europe and the US have to operate at maximum capacity. This means defense manufacturers are ramping up production, which creates thousands of jobs but also strains supply chains. Key materials like specific metals and semiconductors are suddenly in high demand, and that drives global prices upward for everyone. Next is logistics and transportation. Shipping hundreds of vehicles, artillery units, drones, and other equipment across Europe to Ukraine is a monumental task. It involves a coordinated effort using rail, roads, and ports to move supplies efficiently. Every single shipment requires careful security and planning to prevent any losses, sabotage, or delays. Finally, we have maintenance and repair. Sophisticated weapons systems require constant upkeep. Tanks, drones, and artillery need to be serviced regularly, which creates additional labor and financial costs. Factories must produce a continuous stream of spare parts, which further drives industrial demand. So, While that $1 billion figure is plausible financially, it represents the upper limit of NATO's ambitions, not a guaranteed monthly expenditure. Sustaining this level of support for Ukraine isn't just a logistical or financial challenge, it's heavily political. Governments have to balance domestic pressures, strategic commitments, and their global messaging. In Europe, countries like Germany, France, and Italy are facing scrutiny at home. Citizens are asking whether continuous high military spending is sustainable, especially when social services or infrastructure projects are also competing for funding. On the other hand, Eastern European countries like Poland, Lithuania, and Romania strongly support sustained funding, seeing it as absolutely essential for their own national security. Public perception heavily influences political stability, and opposition parties often criticize governments for funding foreign wars at such a high cost. In the United States, support is significant. Washington provides billions in weapons, ammunition, and intelligence. But that funding has to get through Congress, where debates often reflect deep political divisions. Upcoming elections could directly influence whether aid continues at its current level. Strategic messaging is also key. Washington uses its support for Ukraine as a deterrent against Russian expansion and as a clear signal to China about its global geopolitical ambitions. On the global stage, sustained NATO funding demonstrates unity and commitment, but it also increases tensions with Russia. Countries outside of NATO, including China, India, and nations in the Middle East, are watching these decisions closely to gauge future alliances and potential threats. Russia, for its part, frames NATO's support as an escalation, using it in its domestic propaganda to justify its own military mobilization. In short, every dollar spent by NATO is simultaneously a military, economic, and political decision with far-reaching consequences. So, what can we realistically expect in the coming years? Experts suggest three likely scenarios for NATO support moving forward. Scenario A is high support, hitting that $1 billion per month target. This is achievable only if NATO remains politically united. It would require exceptional coordination in industrial production, logistics, and financing. This level of support would maintain maximum pressure on Russia and ensure Ukraine can sustain both offensive and defensive operations. Scenario B is moderate support, closer to $1 billion per quarter. This is considered more realistic due to domestic political pressures and industrial limitations. It would still provide Ukraine with a reliable supply of weapons, but would slow the rate at which new systems could be deployed. Scenario C is minimum support around $1 billion per year. This is the only figure that's been fully confirmed as of 2025. It provides limited assistance, likely focusing on essential ammunition, repair parts, and critical defense systems. The implication here is that media reports often focus on the most ambitious scenario, creating a public perception that might not align with political reality. NATO's funding goals are ambitious, but they are not guaranteed. If NATO does manage to maintain high-level support for Ukraine, the global strategic landscape could shift dramatically. First, it would likely lead to a prolonged conflict for Russia. A continuous supply of advanced weapons would prevent Russia from achieving decisive territorial gains. The conflict would become a drawn-out war of attrition, forcing Moscow to sustain immense economic, military, and domestic pressures for years. Second, it would strengthen NATO unity. Coordinated support reinforces the alliance, showing that NATO can act collectively to support a member. This strengthens deterrence across Europe and sends a clear signal to adversaries about the alliance's resolve. Third, it would lead to a major expansion of the defense industry. European and American defense sectors would benefit economically, creating jobs and driving innovation in areas like drones, precision-guided munitions, and AI-assisted systems. However, this also carries the risk of over-reliance on military-industrial growth, which is sometimes criticized as war profiteering. Fourth, NATO's actions could set a new global military precedent. Supporting a non-member country at this scale is a new chapter in international security policy and might influence how other conflicts are handled worldwide. And finally, the economic consequences. High defense spending affects global markets, particularly for commodities like oil, metals, and semiconductors. As prices rise, it impacts not only military production, but civilian industries as well. So, what do the experts think? Military analysts and economists have weighed in on this complex situation. General Mark Hertman, a retired NATO strategist, has said, "The perception of sustained support is as important as the support itself." Russia calculates based on what it believes NATO will deliver. This shapes operational decisions. Dr. Lena Vogel, a defense economist, notes, $1 billion per month is possible technically, but maintaining that level politically and industrially is a different challenge. Domestic pressures in Europe and the US will influence sustainability. And geopolitical analyst Michael Carver adds, "The conflict is a test case for modern alliance logistics." If NATO succeeds, it demonstrates that military-industrial coordination can sustain high-intensity conflict without direct troop involvement. The consensus among experts is that while ambitious, NATO support is carefully calculated, combining political signaling with operational planning. But what happens if that funding falters? Even a slight reduction in NATO support could have dramatic effects. Ukraine could face severe ammunition shortages, which would reduce its offensive capabilities and make it harder to defend its territory. Russian forces might exploit these temporary weaknesses to try and regain lost ground. On the political front, European unity could fracture if member states start to disagree on how to continue funding, and global markets might react negatively, especially if industrial output drops. This makes the perceived reliability of NATO support almost as critical as the actual weapons being delivered. This conflict highlights several key lessons about modern warfare. First, war isn't just fought on the battlefield. Financial flows, logistics, and alliances are equally decisive. Second, perception is a weapon. The belief in continuous NATO support directly affects the enemy's calculations and strategic planning. Third, industrial capacity defines strategy. Countries with strong defense production capabilities can sustain their allies without deploying their own troops. And finally, political will is decisive. Even with unlimited budgets, you can't overcome domestic opposition, election cycles, and the complex politics of alliances. The war in Ukraine demonstrates how money, politics, and strategy are deeply intertwined, shaping outcomes just as much as bombs and bullets. Looking ahead to 2026 and beyond, NATO's support for Ukraine will depend on several key factors: the political unity among NATO members, their industrial capacity for weapons production, domestic economic and political pressures, and Russia's own military and strategic responses. It will also be affected by broader global conflicts and crises that demand attention and resources. Experts predict that support will likely fluctuate, with ambitious targets sometimes being missed. However, even a moderate, predictable level of funding will allow Ukraine to defend itself and maintain its operational capabilities. In conclusion, the story of NATO and Ukraine is about much more than just weapons or money. It's a story of strategy, perception, and global consequences. That figure of $1 billion per month is technically possible, but it's not officially confirmed. NATO's support is structured, strategic, and politically complex. What is ultimately feasible is determined by industrial capacity, logistics, and the intricate politics of the alliance. This conflict shows us that modern wars are fought with contracts, supply chains, and diplomacy, just as much as with artillery and drones. It's a battle of resources, strategy, and planning, and NATO's billion-dollar ambitions illustrate this vividly. Thanks for watching. If you found this breakdown helpful, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more in-depth analysis.